Good evening, Year 11, and welcome to the night before news for Maths Paper 3. This is the foundation version. Paper 3 is the most important paper. I'm sure you've heard this from your teachers since Paper 2. On average, it is the paper that students perform best on. That is because we're able to narrow down those lists of topics we need to revise because we've already seen Papers 1 and 2. So what you do this evening, what you do tomorrow morning, is going to be the most impactful for this paper than it was for Paper 1 and Paper 2, because we can just narrow down and focus a little bit more on those things we have yet to see. And that's what I'm going to talk through for the majority of this night before news, is what to revise tonight that you can think about after narrowing down what we've seen in Paper 1 and Paper 2. So, if we start, the first thing is we can't say for certain that topics that have already appeared will not come up again, but it makes sense that they're probably not going to, especially when, as we go through this PowerPoint, you'll see there are still lots of things that could come up. I'm starting to talk about ratio and proportion, probably going to make up roughly 30% of this paper. And if you look at what's on the screen, there are lots of topics that could come up. We haven't seen any density, mass or volume, or pressure, force or area. There have been some percentages, but there hasn't been percentage increase or decrease. There hasn't been a reverse percentage yet. Really, really common topics. We haven't seen converting units of length. And although we've seen some ratio, still some more we could see. So if we think about ratio and proportion here, there's lots of topics there, and this is probably going to make up the biggest percentage of marks in this final paper. So thinking about these things that we know come up every year, percentage increase and decrease, right at the bottom there, calculations with time, topics come up time and time again. So ratio and proportion is going to be the biggest section of this paper. This is where I'd focus my revision. If there's things on this list you are not sure about, I would have a look at those to start my revision. The next biggest section is number, again, roughly 30%. We haven't seen any standard form yet, so we expect standard form conversions or calculations. Hasn't been any mention of factors. Always see money problems. There has been money problems. There might be another money problem. Error intervals and reciprocals. All of these things are really common. And again, we haven't seen these. This list isn't as long as the ratio and proportion one, so maybe we might see more of these from this list. But also, I'd say on this list, these are more of the basic number skills, standard form, something students often have lots of success with, and quite a lot of these are those basics. So I was going to focus on anything from this list, it'd be those error intervals, making sure I know that if the question says a number has been rounded to one decimal place to give 3.6, I can write an error interval that says 3.55 is less than the number, which is less than 3.65. And being able to complete that is probably where I would focus most in this section. Algebra, that percentage has come down quite a lot now. We're talking about 20%, but there are lots of algebra skills, again, we haven't seen yet. We haven't seen expanding any bracket, whether that's one bracket by itself, whether that's two brackets touching, whether it's two single brackets, which you then need to simplify. Likewise, we haven't seen any factorising, putting things into brackets. There has been some solving equations, but not involving fractions. And there hasn't been any rearranging or making a different letter the subject of a formula. So again, these would be the things in this section I would really, really focus on. Might only be 20%, but we know the importance of algebra. And some of these algebra skills, again, are those slightly more basic ones, those ones we'd expect lots and lots of students to get correct. So really focusing particularly on expanding, particularly on factorising. Again, they would be the areas I'd be pushing you to think about this evening. From 20% to algebra, we drop to just 10% for geometry. And this list is quite long. It's actually the same length as the ratio and proportion section, but it's going to make up a lot less of that paper. Key things here, trigonometry, one that jumps out at me straight away. Transformations, two things we see year upon year upon year that maybe we haven't seen a lot of these years, this year. So I'd focus on transformations, I'd focus on trigonometry. A couple of different things towards the bottom there. Properties of 3D shapes and properties of 2D shapes have been really, really common in the last few exam series. We haven't seen anything yet. So thinking about faces, edges and vertices, thinking about the names of those 3D shapes could be something we see, as I say, has been really common in the last couple of exam series, and we haven't seen that here. But the big things I'll be thinking about on this page is trigonometry and transformations. And then the smallest section and the smallest list I've shown you is probability and statistics. We've seen quite a few statistical diagrams. We've seen some probability. We haven't seen a scatter graph, and again, they are really, really common. We haven't seen frequency tree or two-way tables. We normally see one or the other of those, sometimes followed up by a probability question. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see a scatter graph and then some other type of diagram that we can draw a probability from. But this is that smallest section that is the least there for us to revise. These are things that hopefully we're confident in doing if we're not really focused on just one or two of these. Probability trees sat there at the bottom, one students often get wrong. Remember, you multiply as you move across your tree, and each of your branches need to add together to make one. But this is the smallest section, smallest amount of things to revise there. Overall, if we're thinking about what we're focusing on this evening, that ratio and proportion, the number and the algebra would be the three areas I would really focus on. In the ratio and proportion, those percentages, writing ratios, maybe density. In number, really thinking about those error intervals, maybe some standard form. And in algebra, having a big focus on expanding brackets, on factorising, and on changing the subjective formula. They would be the places I would direct you to revise. Obviously, if you're really confident on those, have a look back at the slides I've just talked through and pick out anything else you might want to do. How we're going to do this, that message hasn't changed from the previous set of Night Before News. If you want to look at specific topics, you've got all these websites to go to. Sparks Maths, ExamQ, Maths Genie. Both of those are really good for past questions from past papers. Corbett Maths and First Class Maths both provide lots and lots of questions, but we know these things, we've seen these things, these aren't new. Of course, you might want to look at practice papers, probably not as useful before paper 3 because we're really focusing on topics, and lots of past practice papers are going to include other topics we don't need to revise. But if you want to do that, Maths Genie is the place to go. As always, go to Maths Genie and select those papers. But I'm probably not advising you not to do that. I'd be advising you to use one of the websites on the previous slide to really narrow down your focus on some of those topics that we know might come up that you're not as confident with. Last message about tomorrow morning, very similar to what we've seen before. Hub is open from 7 AM, maths teachers will be down there from 7. Been really good before these exams to see so many of you down there. I say this every time, bring those questions you haven't been able to answer. You're not sure about an error interval and you think it's going to come up, bring some examples of those questions and we can talk through them. You've had a go at revising density questions because it's in that ratio and proportion, you've struggled on a couple, bring them in and we can talk through them, and that's what's going to make the difference. We'll line up at 8:25, we'll have revisions in maths classrooms where you see an updated version of that breakfast map, that final piece of revision. Again, pick those things you think you're going to struggle on. Paper 3 is the paper that students do best on because of all of those things I've just talked about. Our view of what we need to revise is so much smaller. So really think about all those things I've talked about. Watch the video again, particularly as I talk through what might come up, and try and focus your revision this evening on some of those key topics. Good luck, Year 11. Last paper for maths this year. I'm sure we're going to smash it.